All right, we're happy to have everyone out today, and we've got Professor Stephanie Connor and Rebecca Sharpe who are going to give us a presentation on the Madwoman in the Attic. And just sort of administratively, I need to note that I've got to leave in about 20 minutes. I had a meeting come up unexpectedly that I need to get to. Got a proctor test for a fellow. So in any event, this is really interesting. We've actually got experience with mental illness in our family, so I've got a personal interest in this stuff, and looking forward to the presentation.
Well, welcome. I'm glad you came today. It's still morning, so hopefully we won't get too depressed about these mad women. The title, Madwoman in the Attic, you may be familiar with that title from another work by Sandra Gilbert and Susan Hoover, who wrote, it was a book more centered on feminism perceptions, and we're going to be doing something a little differently. Today we're going to be talking about mental illness and women writers, specifically at the turn of the century. And we're going to focus on two in particular, Virginia Woolf and Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I knew I was going to forget her name. A couple of years ago, Stephanie and I we both teach the Yellow Wallpaper. Some of you may have read that. It's very popular in the anthologies. And we were talking about it. We were talking about one specific thing in there about the rest cure. And the person's name was Dr. Wire Mitchell. And come to find out there really was such a person. And so we investigated it a little bit more, and it just became very fascinating with what this rest cure was. And then one thing led to another, and we decided that this might be a great topic to present for the Coastal Scholars. Last year we did a presentation on women in fairy tales and folklore. And the reason that we're kind of focusing on the women is for Women's History Month. We don't do a lot on campus for Women's History Month, and we felt like this might be a good opportunity to explore some things that people may not be quite familiar with.
So when we were thinking about this, when I was thinking about this presentation, I was thinking about the concept of crazy women in literature. These are some of the characters that immediately popped into my head, because these are, some of my favorite books. And I thought I'd kind of bring them up really quickly. We have Bertha from Jane Eyre. Now, Bertha was sort of the quintessential Madwoman. She was the Mad Woman in the Attic, so that's where we actually get that term. And when we think about Bertha in Jane Eyre, she was raving. I mean, she was a lunatic. She was incredibly passionate, very, very emotional. So much so that Jane is held up as this model of dignity and composure in the face of all of this raw emotion and madness. And then we have somebody like Mrs. Danvers from Rebecca. I don't know if any of you have read that book. It's really a fascinating story, and one where our main character doesn't even have her own identity. She's not even named. But we have Mrs. Danvers. Now, Mrs. Danvers is not raving and emotional, but she's incredibly manipulative, and her obsession with Rebecca and her manipulation of the main character is frightening in its intensity. And then we have Miss Havisham. I love Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. And if you're familiar at all with that story, you know the character of Miss Havisham and how she walks around her house with the moldering wedding cake and wearing her wedding dress still years and years later after she was jilted at the altar. And so we have her madness, which is caused by being scarred from her own experiences. And that leads her to manipulate the characters around her and to create sort of her ultimate, it's almost like Frankenstein's creature. She creates her own creature in Estella, who wreaks havoc on the men in her life. But what's interesting to note about all of these characters is that their madness is really just a plot point. It's not really explored. It's simply something that moves the story along. It's something that affects the main characters. and it moves them to a place where they need to be in the story. Usually these characters bring about their own destruction. What's interesting about these three, when I really started thinking about it, is every one of these characters is destroyed by fire. That was something that really sort of stood out to me. But none of their illness is really explored. We kind of know why they're a little bit off, but we never really dig into what that means in the story. We don't focus on that. So what we thought we'd do today instead is that we would put mental illness as the focus. And we would look and explore at these writers who struggled with their own mental illness in their lives, and then how that played out in the things that they wrote. And we especially wanted to focus on the 19th and early 20th century concepts of mental health treatment and the idea of domesticity as a key to overcoming mental illness. And this was directly related to this concept of the angel of the house. Now, how many of you guys have heard of that term before, the angel of the house? And this ties into a poem that was written, I think around 1854, by a man named Coventry Patmore. And Coventry Patmore wrote this poem sort of in ode to his wife Emily, who he held up as the perfect wife. And in his poem, he explains that the perfect wife is submissive, she's pure, she basically lives for others. She lives for her husband. At one point, he talks about how the husband can walk into the house and he can say nasty things to the woman, and she sits with pardon in her eyes until he's ready to be nice to her. And once he utters a kind word, she rushes to him and acts like it's all her fault that he got mad in the first place. And so he goes on to talk about in the poem that she is wise in the things that she ought to know and ignorant of all else. And so this concept came about that the woman of the house should be pure, that the man was going to go out and he was going to have to live in the nasty world and experience all the bad things that happened. And when he walked through his doorway at the end of the day, there she would be waiting, and she would be innocent of all of the news, all of the bad stuff that was happening. So it was a sanctuary for him to come home. So she was wise in the things that she ought to know, her domestic responsibilities, but she was ignorant of all else. She didn't read the salacious newspaper. She wasn't aware of the gossip happening. She was submissive, and she was all about him. We're going to focus primarily on two writers. We're going to look at Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and we're going to look at Virginia Woolf. And these were two women during this time period who really pushed back against this idea of domesticity and where they were supposed to fit. I was talking to Rebecca about it. I said, really, when we look at them, they were definitely square pegs trying to fit into a round hole. And because they were sort of hemmed in by this, and they were wonderfully creative in fighting back against this structure, it really caused them to deal with a lot of mental health issues as they were navigating through life. So we're going to explore their lives a little bit, and then we're going to talk about how this translates into their writing. But we wanted to spend a little bit of time, and I'm going to let Rebecca tell you about this whole concept of mental illness around the turn of the century and this fashionable mental illness called neurasthenia.
Neurasthenia. Anybody ever heard of that term before? It was new to me. It was coined in 1869, and if you can think of it, people thought, well, civilization is changing, modern civilization, the fast-pacedness of everything, industrialization. People are working so hard, and because of these things, all of these symptoms are coming forth, and some of them are things that we are very familiar with today, you know, like fatigue and insomnia and headaches and all kinds of different things that are, and think of it like a big umbrella. All of these things fall under this neurasthenia. Poor digestion was another one, exhaustion. Some of us may say, leave here today saying, oh, I've got neurasthenia. But it was sort of a, it took on a positive connotation, really, because you could just say, well, he's suffering from neurasthenia, and it wasn't anything that anybody would be upset about. It was just sort of a very commonplace. But then in the big umbrella think of a subcategory, because women, even though they experienced these symptoms as well, they had some other symptoms that fell under what became known as hysteria, the hysterical woman, hysteria from the Greek word uterus or womb. And some of these included such things as frequent sighings. I think I'm hysterical. Giddiness, convulsive crying, convulsive laughing, and just downright despair. Okay? So the women were kind of in whole nother realm. They still fell under the big neurasthenia, but they also were under hysteria as well. And the doctors believed that any activity of the uterus was thought to accentuate a woman's vulnerability to hysteria. Any activity of the uterus, just let your mind go wild about it.
So as we were exploring this idea of neurasthenia, as it was sort of taking on a life of its own, and what was interesting about neurasthenia too is that it was so distinctly American when it first began. It was more sort of for the middle and upper classes, and so when it did take on that positive connotation, it was sort of a mark of honor if you had neurasthenia, because it sort of puts you in a different social class. But because of this, different treatments began to arise. And it's important, if we're going to talk about these different treatments, to talk about the rest cure. And we're going to focus quite heavily on the rest cure today. And I've got a little quote up here from the yellow wallpaper. It says, "John says if I do not pick up faster, he will send me to Weir Mitchell in the fall." And that was the line that when we were going through the yellow wallpaper that really stood out. And I always tell my students when they're reading, authors, especially in things like short stories, don't just randomly put things because they think that name sounds good. There's a reason behind being that specific. And so if an author is that specific, it probably is a good idea to do a little research to find out what that means or who that is. And so we began to explore who exactly was this Weir Mitchell. And we came up with Silas Weir Mitchell. Interesting enough, there's also a current actor named Silas Weir Mitchell, and so when you first look him up, that's who pops up. But this is not the guy who plays on the popular TV series Grimm. This was a famous doctor during the 19th century. Now, he really sort of rose to prominence during the Civil War, and Dr. Mitchell worked with wounded Civil War soldiers, especially those who had suffered nerve damage from bullet wounds. And many of these soldiers were bedridden, and they were suffering symptoms of neurasthenia because of the chronic pain from these wounds. And so really their only option was amputation. But Silas Weir Mitchell began to sort of pioneer and develop a treatment for these soldiers to help deal with the mental aspects of these really damaging wounds. And they were made up of sort of four major components. It was rest, a fat diet, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, massage and electrical stimulation. The massage and the electrical stimulation were important because these soldiers were bedridden, and so they wanted to make sure that the muscles didn't atrophy. But these were really the four components that made up the rest cure. There was another aspect to the electrical stimulation as well. This was a way for Weir Mitchell to determine if any of the soldiers were malingering. And it's interesting when I talk to my students about this, and my veterans in the class are very quick to be able to answer what it means to be a malingerer. And essentially that just meant that you were laying off of work, that you were pretending to have something wrong with you so that you wouldn't have to do these jobs that you didn't want to do. Now this is going to be important. This is going to tie back in a few minutes to when we talk about women and the rest cure. But Weir Mitchell had very, very little tolerance for malingerers. So a lot of time with this electrical stimulation, he could determine whether or not these soldiers were malingering. But this was all part of how he began to pioneer this idea of the rest cure, which sounds pretty good so far, right? Well, he worked so hard during the Civil War that around 1864 he suffered his own bout of mental illness, that he had a breakdown himself. He diagnosed himself with neurasthenia, and he had to sort of take a break from things. But when he came back into practice, he began to sort of incorporate a new clientele. And it was the class well known to every physician, nervous women who as a rule are thin and lack blood, okay? All these really, really nervous, thin women. He did not like them because he really believed that most thin women suffered from nerves because they lacked enough fat in their red blood cells to be able to go about their duties effectively. I like this quote from Mitchell. He said, "A hysterical girl is, as Wendell Holmes has said in his decisive phrase, a vampire who sucks the blood of healthy people about her." So essentially, where Mitchell was saying that a lot of times these women who claimed to have something wrong with them were simply just showing symptoms of hysteria, and they were feeding off of the sympathy that they were getting from the people around them. And he had absolutely no patience for that. He wanted to get them up and about and doing the things that they needed to do. And so he began to apply the rest cure to these women. So he wrote this very sort of quintessential book in 1877 called Fat and Blood and How to Make Them. Don't you want to rush out and read that? Yeah, Fat and Blood and How to Make Them. And in this book, he really begins to document the rest cure. Now, when I first heard about the rest cure, I said, I'd like some of that, right? You know, I mean, I'm tired. I've got a lot on my plate. I would love to just go kick my feet up for a little while, you know, read a book, have nobody bothering me. That's not really what the rest cure was. So let's break this down so you really understand this. But I'll do the quote first. The rest I like for female invalids is not at all their notion of rest. To lie abed half the day and sew a little and read a little and be interesting and excite sympathy is all very well. But when they are bidden to stay in bed a month and neither read, write, nor sew, and to have one nurse who is not a relative, then rest becomes for some women a rather bitter medicine, and they are glad enough to accept the order to rise and go about. So here's how the rest cure worked in most cases. It was very, very highly regimented, and it lasted anywhere from 6 weeks to 2 months. And during this time, the women were isolated from their friends and family. They were confined to bed, and at least during the first few weeks, they were confined to bed to the point where they could not even sit up, and they couldn't turn over without the doctor's permission. Okay, so imagine this. You're confined to bed, and you can't even turn over unless the doctor gives you permission to turn over. You had to get permission to sit up in bed. Most of the time, somebody fed you, okay, for the first few weeks of treatment. You were not allowed to have any type of intellectual activity. So no reading, no writing, no listening to music, no visits from friends or family, no intellectual activity whatsoever. Now, that enough would put me over the edge. Now, see, I am lazy by nature, and I could park myself on the couch and spend all day reading a book, but I'm just one of those people that I get really nervous if I don't have a book to read. Like, I just have to know that a book is waiting for me, and so the idea of just sort of being completely isolated with no way to entertain myself intellectually is, I can't even stomach the thought of this. So this is all part of this very highly regimented cure. But then there's the diet. Okay, and this is a really big part of this. So the diet was really, really high in fat, because remember that where Mitchell believed that these thin women were nervous because they lacked blood in their system. So he needed to fatten them up. So the diet during the rest cure consisted, he loved milk. So milk was a really big part of this particular diet. 3 to 4 pints of milk a day, okay, usually taken before or during meals. Bread and butter 3 to 4 times a day, a mutton chop for lunch, after a big breakfast. And then this one was the one that killed me. It was a pound of raw beef in the form of a soup. And you would chop up raw beef and put it in a pint of water, add a few drops of chlorohydric acid, and let that sit for a while, and then that would be given during the course of the day, because that had a lot of iron. He believed in iron supplements, so lots of iron. Sometimes this would be supplemented with cod liver oil, doses of cod liver oil, sometimes with strychnine or arsenic as well, which is absolutely terrifying. Women who refused were sometimes fed through the nose or through the rectum. So force feeding was often a part of this process. His experiences with his own neurasthenia did not make him any more sympathetic to his patients that he believed were hysterical. He did not have any sympathy at all for hysterical women, because remember, he considered them vampires. That really all these women were doing was just trying to elicit sympathy. In other words, he believed that there wasn't really anything wrong with them except just a little fattening up. And so by putting them to bed, by isolating them, by keeping them from any type of intellectual stimulation, because he believed that intellectual stimulation harmed a woman's ability to do her duties, he was sort of forcing them out of bed to get up and go and do something. So the rest here doesn't really sound like something that I would like to partake in. But what's interesting to note is that both of the women that we're going to talk about today in their writings, both of these women underwent the rest cure, and one of them in particular with Silas Ware Mitchell.
Okay, well, if you're a woman and you have the rest cure, that doesn't sound very appealing. However, if you're a man, you're going to have a little different attitude towards the rest cure. Men got a whole different treatment. They got to go out west, they got to ride and rope and play cowboy and male bonding, all those good things. They came back, they were invigorated, they were healthier, and oftentimes they would go again in a year or two because it was so much fun. They come back, they're ready to go again. Some of the more prominent ones, Theodore Roosevelt went before he became president. He was, you know, if you see pictures of him as a president, he's very robust, very masculine looking, but before he went, he was not like that. The accounts say he was a very weakly looking, very effeminate. He comes back and he's strong and manly and powerful. And Walt Whitman was another, and Owen Wister, who is famous for writing The Virginian. These are just a few of the men that took advantage of the rest cure rather than the rest cure. So, like I said, they came back, and it was so beneficial to them that they were apt to go again. Whereas many of these women, they feared the rest cure. Virginia Woolf wrote about it. She just was not looking forward to having that again. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, same thing. Totally opposite the way they were treated. Yeah, the domestic life. Now we talked a little bit about the angel of the house. You know, you've heard the term, keep the home fires burning. That's what the woman did. She kept everything going. She kept the house in order, kept the children happy, don't bother daddy when he gets home, you know, cooking, cleaning, and all of that good stuff, which is fine, that's great. But some women are not cut out for that. That's not where they get their feeling of value. Mitchell believed that the intellectual pursuits undermine a woman's ability, that she shouldn't be doing these things, that it's going to hurt her in the long run. She should be resting. She should be doing her domestic duties. He discouraged women from working outside the home. During this time period, it was very rare that a woman worked outside the home if she was upper middle class or upper class. You know, some of the lower classes had to work outside the home. But even though they may have needed the money, that was frowned upon. Why? Because it looked like the man could not provide for his family if his wife was out working outside of the home. So this was frowned upon as well. And then the recovery was tied to reproduction. You know, you're going to be happier if you have a family. You're going to be happier if you are doing your domestic duties and the things that you should be doing. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, for instance, Stephanie's going to tell you more about her, but she had a child, but she wasn't happy in that environment. She had to leave her child with her husband and his new wife for her to find happiness. So he couldn't really understand that women had different ideas of happiness. They should be happy at home doing their domestic jobs. That angel in the house. Virginia Woolf will talk about how she has to kill the angel in the house to be successful, because it's always hovering over her. It's always making her feel resentful, or even feel that she's not doing her duty because she's not being what is expected of her. She's following those intellectual pursuits instead.
Mitchell often would weigh his patients regularly, and so a significant gain in weight was a good sign that the woman was on her way to recovery. And for him, once a woman was able to have her cycle regularly, and especially if she could get pregnant and carry a pregnancy to term, that was an indication that he had been very successful with his rest cure. So that's how he decided whether or not a woman was cured, was whether or not she could reproduce successfully. So you can see pictures oftentimes. Women oftentimes would gain anywhere from 25 to 30 pounds during the course of this rest cure treatment, but he significantly tied it to her ability to reproduce as curing her of any type of mental ailment that she might have. So we'll talk a little bit about Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Oh, I wanted to talk really quickly too, because when you were talking about he believed that the woman's ultimate role, like to be happy, was to have a family and take care of her family. We just finished doing A Doll's House in my English 1102 classes, and at the very end of that movie, when Nora, or the play, we watched the movie too when we finished the play, but at the very end of that, Torvald tells Nora, you can't leave because you are first and foremost a mother and a wife. And she looks at him and she says, no, I'm a human being. And so it really sort of ties into that idea of where women identified and where society made women identify. And one of the women who really pushed back against this idea was Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And the more I'm reading about her, the more I'm just fascinated with her life and her mindset. She definitely took the world from a very feminist perspective. One of her most influential works was called Women in Economics, and she really advocated for women's financial independence. She thought that women needed to work to be financially independent, that would give them a sense of value and put them on more equal terms with being able to even talk with their husbands. And so that's something that's still very relevant today, the idea that women should be able to be financially independent. But she was a very interesting person growing up. She was directly related to the Beechers and Harriet Beecher Stowe, so she had a lot of literary influence in her family. There was also a history of depression and suicide in her family as well, so she struggled with that genetically. But for her whole life, she really felt like there was more to what she needed to do than just being a wife and a mother. And for the longest time, she really dug in her heels and pushed back against what she considered, and I wrote this down, a waste of, what did she call this? A sense of wasting power in terms of if she just gave herself over strictly to a domestic life, that she was wasting this energy that she had to be able to do what she called great works and needful things in her life. So she did marry, but what's interesting about her relationship with Charles Walter Stetson, who was an artist, is they actually did have a very passionate relationship. They desired each other, and he really appreciated her where she was, but she was not feeling the whole marriage thing. She actually wrote a document called Anchor to Windward, where she basically lists out all the reasons why she shouldn't get married. And a lot of that is tied into the idea that she didn't want to lose her freedom, that she wanted a home of her own and she wanted independence. But she was incredibly torn by this desire for her own independence, this desire for freedom and this intellectual prosperity, and then what society was telling her she needed to do. And she really did desire Charles Walter Stetson. So eventually she sort of gave in, and she did get married, and they had a daughter, Catherine. And shortly after she had her daughter, Catherine, she suffered a mental break. Now, today, we would more than likely diagnose her with postpartum depression. that wasn't something that was discussed during this time period. So she just sort of had this mental break, and she was encouraged to undergo the rest cure. And so she was sent to a sanitarium. She went to see Dr. Weir Mitchell. Now, immediately, they took a dislike to each other. She wrote to him really asking for help. She knew that something was wrong. She believed that there was something not right, and she wanted to feel better. And that was part of the problem with a lot of these women, is that they knew that there was something going on, but nobody believed them. Oh, you just need to get some fresh air and you'll be fine. And really, I think we still struggle with that idea with depression today. When people are suffering from depression, people who don't understand depression will say, oh, you just need to think positively and everything will be fine. And that's not how it works. And so these women were really trying to say there's something wrong with me. And instead, they were being treated like they were hysterical. So she wrote to Weir Mitchell and said, I really want you to help me because I believe that I'm intended for this larger purpose. And I want you to help me. Well, he thought her letter was just full of self-conceit, and he immediately diagnosed her as a hysteric, which was the class of women that he absolutely had no patience for. But she underwent the rest cure. She actually went to the sanitarium and underwent the rest cure. And for all intents and purposes, she had a fairly nice time at the sanitarium. It was when she went back home that there were problems, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. After she got back home and she realized that she just couldn't be this domestic woman that she needed to be, she did something that was almost unheard of. She left her husband, she divorced her husband, and she moved out to California. What's interesting about that is that she did help arrange the marriage between her husband and her best friend. So they all stayed sort of close in that respect. And after a while, she sent her daughter, Catherine, back home to live with her ex-husband and her best friend because she felt like that was the best environment. And it was once that happened and she was sort of free out of California that her most productive work began. She sort of fell out of, I don't want to say fell out of favor, but she was forgotten for quite a long time until around the 70s, the 1970s, where her work, especially the yellow wallpaper, was rediscovered. And now it's talked about as probably her most famous work that we know. It's the one that's the most often anthologized. But in the yellow wallpaper, which was written in 1892, this is very semi-autobiographical because it's about a woman who is suffering from nerves. Now what we know is we read the stories that the woman has recently had a baby, so again, probably suffering from postpartum depression, and she's taken to this country estate. And we know from the very beginning of the story that this woman is very fanciful, that she's creative, because she immediately wants the house to be haunted. As soon as, like, the very first few lines, she's hoping that the house is haunted. And that tells us that this is a woman who's used to creative thought and thinking and sort of intellectual, fanciful pursuits. But she's taken to the country to rest. And she's put under the care of her husband, John, who is a doctor. And at one point in the story, she says, I would never say this to John, but I really feel like if he weren't a doctor, I'd probably get better faster. Because John doesn't believe that there's really anything wrong with her that a little rest can't cure. So she, and her brother is also a doctor as well, so she's sort of put under all these strictures. She wants to be in this beautiful downstairs room with roses growing all over and a walkway outside, but her husband says, no, you're going to be in this room upstairs, and it's this old nursery, which I think is problematic anyway if you've got a woman who's suffering from postpartum depression and who feels like she can't make a connection with her child. Let's put her in the nursery by herself. And this nursery is, the way it's described, it has bars on the window, and really it had bars on the window because children were in there, they didn't want them falling out of the window, but the bars on the window, the bed is nailed to the floor, and so it's very prison-like when it's described, but most descriptive is the peeling yellow wallpaper in this room. And because she doesn't have the benefit of any creative outlet, because she's not allowed to read or to have a lot of company, she's slowly driven crazy by the patterns in the wallpaper. That becomes her obsession because she has no other way of dealing with the creative thoughts that are happening, this isolation, this lack of ability to work. She obsesses with the wallpaper and she begins to see patterns in the wallpaper. And eventually the pattern forms into a woman, and she believes that there's a woman trapped behind the wallpaper. And so eventually she goes crazy through her experiences, and John finds her at the very end where she's peeled off all of the wallpaper and she is creeping around the room, and she actually crawls over her husband as he faints from the shock of seeing his wife this way. So it was incredibly shocking when it was written, and this was her way of kind of processing and dealing with what she went through with her own bout with the rest cure. So after she wrote this in 1913, she actually published an article in Forerunner, and it was called Why I Wrote the Yellow Wallpaper. And she explained, because she had a lot of people writing to her, and at one point somebody wrote to her and says, "This is such an astute and frightening view of insanity and of mental illness. Have you ever been there yourself?" And so she writes this in response to that particular question. And when she was partaking of the rest cure, when Mitchell declared her cured, he sent her home, and he says that she was to live as domestic a life as far as possible, to have but 2 hours of intellectual life a day, and to never touch pen, brush, or pencil as long as she lived. So she was forbidden, as part of this, to just go about her domestic duties without being able to pursue her intellectual career. So it says that I went home and obeyed those directions for some 3 months and came so near the borderline of utter mental ruin that I could see over. And so fortunately she had some good friends and some support who said, listen, this isn't working for you. You need to start writing again. You need to be able to express yourself and have this outlet. And so she does, and she's able to kind of come out of that depression that she was under. What we need to understand about this, though, is that Weir Mitchell considered Gilman hysteric. He was very unsympathetic for her desire to make her fit for a larger purpose. But it's important to note that the yellow wallpaper was embellished. It was a good deal of time between when Gilman underwent the rest cure and when she wrote the yellow wallpaper. She never suffered her own bouts of hallucination. And even in the yellow wallpaper itself, the woman in the yellow wallpaper doesn't strictly follow the rest cure. And so we have to take it as what it is, that there were embellishments, and there were women who benefited from the rest cure. So I don't want to completely vilify Dr. Mitchell, and he was considered very enlightened for his time, because he advocated that they shouldn't just start performing hysterectomies whenever a woman exhibited any type of mental illness, which up to that point had been sort of the general treatment. Let's just take out your ovaries and that should make everything okay. So actually Weir Mitchell was considered very enlightened in his approach to treatment, and some women really did benefit from it. But other women, especially very creative women who desired to do something more than just be the angel of the house, they were the ones who really suffered for this treatment. And so really, Gilman and Mitchell did not like each other, and so we really kind of have to understand that as she was writing. We take it for what it is, but her writing really did sort of shine a light, and it was one of the first stories that really sort of put the spotlight on mental illness and how you could really talk specifically about that in literature.
Okay. So we began thinking about other women who may have experienced similar symptoms or the rest cure as well, and one that we found was Virginia Woolf, and you may be familiar with Virginia Woolf. She was born into a very prominent English family. Her father, Sir Leslie Stephen, was an author, a critic. He authored a biography of history, Dictionary of National Biography, and her mother was a real beauty. She was a model for many artists during that time period. So when they got married, they were both widowers, and so they brought children into the marriage. So her parents, she had a brother and a sister, and then these other children that were brought into the family as well. So there was a very big household. She had bouts of mental illness throughout her writing career. When she was 13, her mother died unexpectedly, and then 2 years later, her stepsister Stella died, and this was the first time that she was diagnosed and she was institutionalized. Throughout her writing career, she had other bouts, and usually it was after she had worked really hard on a novel or a piece of work, and it was almost like she was coming down off of that, and she would have these severe bouts of depression. Well, her doctor, her family doctor, was George Savage, and he was a proponent of Dr. Wire Mitchell's Rest Cure. And so she was a product of that. Now, remember what we said about the Rest Cure. You're totally isolated. And this was very hard for Virginia Woolf because she was a very outgoing person. She was resentful that she was never able to go to college like her brothers. Her brothers went to Cambridge. She benefited from the large library that they had in their home, so she was pretty much self-taught. And then when her brothers would come home and bring their friends, and she was probably more intellectual than they were. They loved to be around her. I read an account one time, and I never will forget it. They were talking about Virginia Woolf and a group of this Bloomsbury group, and this was a group that of intellectuals and artistic people that came together, and this is where she met her husband, Leonard Woolf, and also her sister, Vanessa, who was an artist, met her husband, Clive Bell. But it was talking about how they were all sitting outside one day, and they said, excuse me, if you could pick anyone in the world to walk down this path right now to join us, who would you pick? And they all said Virginia. Now, that tells you how popular she was, how everybody wanted to be around her. She was gregarious, she was intellectual, she was witty, she had comebacks all the time for things that were said. And so for her to be put in this isolation, you can understand how hard that would be for her. She believed that women should be self-sufficient, just like Charlotte Perkins Gilman believed. Some of you may be very familiar with her work, A Room of One's Own, where a woman should have money and a place of her own to go to be able to write. And she felt like if they had those things, then they could make it. Otherwise, they don't have a chance, not during that time. There's too many other things that they had to overcome. She gave a speech, it's called The Professions of Women, which later developed into a novel that she wrote. But during this presentation, this is one of the things that she said that I thought was, think about the angel of the house. She was intensely sympathetic. She was immensely charming. She was utterly unselfish. She excelled in the difficult arts of family life. She sacrificed herself daily. If there was chicken, she took the leg. If there was a drought, she sat in it, like a draft. In short, she was so constituted that she never had a mind or a wish of her own, but preferred to sympathize always with the minds and the wishes of others. The angel of the house, self-sacrificing, doing what's best for everybody else, giving up that breast for the chicken leg, you know. We know how that is. But it was a real experience. It was an experience that was bound to befall all women writers at the time. Killing the angel of the house was part of the occupation of a woman writer. And then she goes on to say that it's harder, the angel of the house was like a phantom. And it's harder to kill a phantom than it is reality. And so when you're working, that phantom keeps creeping in. And she talks a little bit about how she was doing a critique of a man's work, and she kept thinking that angel kept creeping in. Now, don't be too critical. You don't want to hurt his feelings. You don't want to do this. You don't want to do that. She couldn't help that kept coming back into play as she was writing about it. She also talked about how, in this particular speech, that for women writers, they were better off than many women who were in other occupations because the way had been paid for them somewhat with people like Jane Austen and George Eliot. And it didn't take much to be a writer. Yes, you had to have a room of your own, okay? A little bit of money in your pocket, but it doesn't cost much to buy paper, doesn't cost much to buy ink, and the scratching on the paper doesn't cause too many disturbances within the household. So she said she was better off, and women writers were better off than these other women that were going into other occupations. So that's sort of the point that she was trying to make there. Okay, and we chose Ms. Dalloway. I don't know if y'all are familiar with Ms. Dalloway. This was sort of converted into a movie based on Ms. Dalloway a few years ago, The Hours. But it's about a character, well actually it's about two characters. We think of Ms. Dalloway, Clarissa, as the main character, but there's another very important character in this as well. She is not really suffering on the outset of mental illness. Now, if you remember Virginia Woolf, she's a modernist, and her stream of consciousness technique and that inner monologue technique were very important in her writing. And so we take this character, Clarissa Dalloway, as one day, and she's making preparations for a party that night. And so in that one day, she's thinking about, the mind moving back and forth, who is invited to the party. So that spurs her to think about how she knew those people long ago. And so she starts talking about how her life has changed and things have changed in her life. Her old boyfriend is coming, an old friend is coming, and how they have changed over the years. And so she's just preparing her mind for this party and preparing everything else at the same time. But there's another character who gets overlooked a little bit, and this is Septimus Warren Smith. Now, he has some mental illness that's very obvious. He is suffering from PTSD. He has come back from World War I. He is hallucinating. He is overcome with grief for his comrade who has died. Can't get over that. And he is going to get the rest cure. Okay? His doctor thinks he needs to go off and rest. He'll be better. But there's some hints in there as well that perhaps the doctor thinks that he is a malingerer. Remember how Weir Mitchell, those soldiers that came back, they were just trying to get out of combat, or the women didn't want to do their domestic duties, they're malingerers. There's a hint there that he is a malingerer as well. And at the end, he's going to have him go back into the hospital and experience the rest cure, but he can't take it. So what does he do? He jumps out of a window and commits suicide. How does this tie in with Clarissa Dalloway? Well, the way it ties in is at the beginning of her party, everybody is happy and everything is going great, and all of a sudden, almost at the climax of the party, here comes the news that this person that they really don't even know has jumped out of a window and committed suicide. So it's very upsetting to everybody. The tie-in, at one time, Virginia Woolf jumped out of a window and tried to commit suicide. He is hearing, he's having hallucinations. She had hallucinations. She even writes that he is hearing the birds chirping in Greek. And she says that that is one of the experiences that she had as well. Virginia Woolf's husband believed that she was not, that she did not suffer from neurasthenia. He believed that she was manic depressive. And he wrote that because of that, she should not have had the treatment that she was getting. That was the worst thing that she could have, to be in isolation. And he also wrote that the doctors had not the slightest idea of the nature of the cause of Virginia's mental state. All they could say was that she was suffering from neurasthenia, and that if she could be induced or compelled to rest and eat, and she was another one of these thin, nervous types, And if she could be prevented from committing suicide, she would recover. Some speculate that she committed suicide in 1941 due to her fear of having to undergo the rest cure again, much like the character of Septimus Warren Smith.
It's interesting to note too that Charlotte Perkins Gilman also committed suicide, but her suicide was related. She actually went on to have a very successful life, but she was diagnosed with breast cancer in its very late stage, and she was a very big proponent of dying with dignity. She was one of the first advocates for euthanasia, and so she would prefer chloroform to the sort of undignified death from cancer. So she wound up committing suicide rather than succumb to cancer. But she also, again, sort of a little ahead of her time with the way that she thought about things. So we thought we'd kind of end things here with coming out of the attic and how these women opened the door for the discussion of mental illness in literature, and some of the women who sort of followed in her footsteps and really brought this to the forefront. These popularized stories really paved the way for these conversations. Sylvia Plath, I had to put her up there because her novel, The Bell Jar, about Esther Greenwood, it explores lots of autobiographical elements in that story with a young woman who experiences depression and tries to commit suicide a couple of different times and undergoes different treatments for that. And it was very sort of revolutionary when the story was written and ties very much into Plath's own life. And then there's a wonderfully sort of bleak and stark and lovely story by Gail Godwin called A Sorrowful Woman. I don't know if any of you have read that, but it's just this very unflinching look at a woman suffering from a great depression. Everything in the story is gray. The sweater that her husband wears is gray. They have gray eyes. The child is playing with something that's gray. The color gray is very pervasive. But she just sort of, one day she's in the kitchen doing something and she turns around and all of a sudden she can't bear the thought of looking at her child. She can't bear the thought of having a conversation with her husband. And so it's this very sort of stark, very raw look at what happens to this woman in this depressive state. And so I think that this is important. I think it's important that Charlotte Perkins Gilman and Virginia Woolf began these discussions and really let this come to the forefront, because these types of stories, to get it out there, to put it in literature, can really impact people who are suffering with their own issues, to know that they're not alone, to know that there are these outlets and ways to express things. And we thought we'd end, I like to end these presentations with a poem. I ended with a poem on our last presentation. So I just took a little stanza from Stevie Smith's poem, Not Waving But Drowning, which was written in 1957. And I thought it was really an apropos ending, because I feel like this is probably what these women were thinking when they said, somebody just believe us when we say that there's something wrong. Oh, no, 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 it was too cold always, still the dead wind lay moaning. I was much too far out all my life, and not waving, but drowning. So thank you guys so much. I hope we just sort of shed some light. It was a very